semester. Today with us we have a guest speaker, V. Geeta, who is a feminist, historian, writer, translator, and a publisher who has been active in Indian women's movement for 4 decades. She has written in English and Tamil on gender, caste, labor, and education. Geeta is also a public sorry. He is also a teacher and over the years has run many impromptu classes in histories of women's movement, gender, and sexuality. Please give a big round of applause to welcome them.
Hi. Thanks for coming in on a hot, early summer afternoon. Um, so we're going to be discussing something that we seldom talk in, let's say, less excited terms than we talk other things. Caste is a source of excitement for many of us in different ways. So I want to start with some questions which I'm not going to answer, but you can put those questions down and think for yourselves. So what is the word for caste in our various languages? I'm sure there are students from different linguistic groups here, in Gujarati, in Urdu, in Tamil, in Malayalam. What is the word for caste? Is it close to the word jati or is it very different? That's one question. Secondly, in our homes, sitting with our parents, our grandparents, extended family, how does the question of caste come up? Does it have to do with food? Does it have to do with clothes, work, friends, potential boyfriends or girlfriends or other friends? Is caste invoked in these contexts, in your conversations at home? In the classroom, in your school days, in the university, caste perhaps comes up in one very well-known context. What would that be? In educational institutions, what is the word associated with caste? Louder? Reservation. And what other words cluster around reservation? Seldom only about reservation, there are other words that are part of that group. What would those words be? Quotas, and then government acronyms, SC, ST, OBC, BC, FC, OC. Right? So caste is sort of brought home to us through these acronyms. And we have very mixed feelings about these kinds of words. We're not sure if reservation is a good thing or a bad thing. We're not sure if these acronyms mean anything beyond them being categories that you fill on a form or don't fill on a form. Whereas at home, we encounter caste in other ways, and which is what you'll be thinking about as I get on with my presentation later on. So what I want to do in this talk, I have divided it into 3 parts, is to explore along with you how we might responsibly and critically think about caste. And why is it important to think about caste in this way? So this is what I wish to do. So my talk has 3 sections, and the first section is called Caste of Mind. And I'm going to start with something that some of you may even know about. Tanishka Sodhi is a well-known influencer on Instagram. So if you haven't seen her work, please follow her. She's quite interesting. She's from a small town in northern India, northwestern India. And she got very famous with thousands of likes for some reels that she did over the last few weeks. Much of this has to do with a question that was raised by a bunch of people who went to court over the decision of the University Grants Commission. You don't have to worry about the details of this story, except that given that there have been many student suicides in universities, especially students from the Bahujan, Dalit and Adivasi communities, the University Grants Commission had prepared a set of guidelines and suggested that in every university there ought to be a forum where you can take your complaints. And You can have discussions, you can have arbitration, much like POSH committees, Prevention of Sexual Harassment committees. Now, those who are termed the upper castes, some of them got extremely belligerent about this decision. They said, what do you mean? You're going to put us in a spot? People might use this opportunity to badmouth us. People could sort of settle scores using this law. And they wanted the guidelines pushed back. Anyway, the matter is in court now. We won't discuss that. But it was in that context that Kanishka came up with these reels and these various messages about basically saying, what do you think is so different from about us, that everyone piles on to us in some ways, that they think we are oppressors, that we are doing things to people. Don't you get it? We are the best. So that's the general tone of her Instagram. And you see how she tries to get funny in that phrase. I don't need to explain what that means, right? You get it on the other side. Basically saying you can aspire for anything, but how can you ever be called a Brahmin? It's making it very clear that it's something that only those who are designated Brahmin at birth can continue to be Brahmins forever. Now, why is she saying it? It's a very interesting question. Think of it in the context of the UGC regulations. So, does she represent all Brahmins? We don't know, except that she's very liked. And we'll see how she sees herself. So this is what she was interviewed and asked about why is she doing this and what does she think of her own, popularity and so on. And she has two things to say. She says, what's wrong? Brahmins are respected everywhere, in my village, in my town, etc., etc. And then she says, I got a lot of likes, so I started to do more of this. So you have this very interesting situation where a young woman responds to something and puts forth these claims of Brahmins being the best, and then backs it up by saying, what's wrong? That's how it is. It may not be untrue in all cases. And then she goes on to say, but actually I must also confess, I got more likes. So she went on to do more of the same thing, and you all know how Instagram works. I don't have to tell you. So obviously this meant that she was going to be popular for a very long time. So what you have is a sense of entitlement, and which is how I start this thing. Caste as entitlement. You have a sense of entitlement, and you have a sense of doing something because it pays to do that thing. Here it's not monetary rewards, but it's like I'm really popular. Folks like me. So let's think of what the word entitlement can mean in our contexts. Again, a question, just put it down. We'll come back to it at discussion time. And I'll also come back to it in a while, right? So this is one form of thinking about caste. One way in which today's young people who are a little older than you, think about caste. Which is why I've titled this section, Castes of Mind. We're thinking about caste and expressing ourselves in certain ways. So this is one example. This is the second one, and here, these are three very interesting books that have been published over the last 10 or 15 years. They're about India's business communities. And you all know the word business communities conjures up certain names of certain communities for all of us. They could be Marwaris, they could be Agarwals, they could be people that are associated with business in different parts of the country. If it was Tamil Nadu, I would say Chettiars. So there are different business communities, and there's been some really interesting writing on these communities, and there's even a new series out, I think by Penguin, about the history of Indian business, all of which are very important, I think, because histories of money making are very, very fascinating. How do we make money? What is profit? How do we start a business? I don't know if these are things that are taught in IIMs here, but clearly there are ways in which Indian business houses function that are fairly distinctive. And these books are all about why they are distinctive. And I want you to notice the subtitles. India's New Capitalists, this was written about 15 years ago, maybe this book. Caste, Business and Industry in a Modern Nation. Second one, Fraternal Capital. Third one, Fortune Seekers, a history of the Natukottai Chettiars. The middle book doesn't mention caste as such, but it uses the word fraternal. And it tells you how in the great export town of Tirupur, which is near in Chennai, it is in Tamil Nadu, how did people set up businesses? And it focuses on a certain community, which was an agrarian community, used to farming, then mopped up money through its caste networks, and by using the dowry that women brought into the household to start businesses. So in all three cases, you see that caste connections, caste identities are a form of resource. They allow you to start a business, they allow you to sustain a business, they allow you to sell things that you make. They help you with this. And therefore, caste, depending on which caste you belong to, is a form of resource. So let's go back to the earlier one, caste as entitlement. There, it's not claimed as a resource, it's claimed as it's my right to say I'm better than all others. Here, no one says anything. You don't have business houses coming out and saying, we were created to do business. No one says that. Instead, we all know how they speak about themselves. I worked very hard. I started out with a very little business. Look at Ambani, who was he before he became whatever he became? So there's a way in which there is a focus on how money is made. It all has to do with individual capacity, individual talent, and so on. And anyone can make money in this country. Anyone can build an industry if they have doggedness, if they are persistent, if they know how to run a business. Having said that, the business communities of India are also unable to claim their identity with great fanfare like the Brahmins do. Now again, think back. In your own languages, there are many jokes about business communities in all our languages. If you think of proverbs, think of idiomatic statements, you can trust so and so, but not this one. Watch out for a person from this community, he can squeeze water out of a piece of stone. You know, things which point to how business communities can be very smart, very clever. They can actually sort of cajole you to part with your grandmother's jewels. There are all kinds of sayings in our languages. So there's a sense in which they are derided, at the same time there's grudging respect. You know, these people, wow, look at the way they make money, but at the same time, wow, they make money. So I've just put down some things that are a mix of words used to describe business communities, at least in the Tamil language. Again, you can think of how this works in your language, and if perhaps you're not familiar, you can ask folks. It will be very interesting to know how is it that we view, how do we view these communities? They are powerful, they are rich, they control many things in today's context, including education. Many of them invest in education. Think of the Azim Premji University, think of all the Tata institutes, think of the Dhirubhai Ambani Institute. Many of them work at large in different contexts. But yet, they don't sort of come out and assert their identity because they have to live with this very ambiguous sense of how we understand business communities as a people. You know? At the same time, they are very powerful. So for them, being part of a particular community means that whatever that community enjoys by way of respect or money or contacts is available to them. Not to all of them, but certainly to those who can push and get their way through. So this is something that you will find when you read these business histories. It's quite fascinating. So caste is entitlement, caste is resource. So what is the caste of business in India? It's very, very interesting. Can anyone become a successful businessman or woman or other kind of person? Or are some communities more likely to be powerful in the realm of business? And can we therefore talk of the caste of business? This is something that we can also think about. The third thing, this is a very interesting phenomenon that was observed for a few years, I think in Delhi for a while, and here perhaps here as well, where you have names of particular communities on cars, and you can see the names here, those who can't read Hindi, Jat, Yadav, Kshatriya, and so on, and many other names were also put on these cars. I think then the Supreme Court had to pass a judgment saying that you are not allowed to put anything on those cars except what the RTO office allows you to put on them. So why would anyone do this? Why put your name on the back of a car? And who are the people that are doing it? And these are the most popular ones from one reckoning, from some someone who got interested in this has done a statistical analysis, and they've said, at least in the Delhi metropolitan area, I don't know about Ahmedabad and other places, the most commonly used names were Jat, Yadav, and Kshatriya. So, who are these people? Why are they doing this? This is very, very interesting again. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I want to pick on this community that straddles several states in India: Rajasthan, Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, which is the Jat community, and the Punjab, of course. And typically, the Jats are associated with agriculture, with agrarian matters. They are very hardworking farmers. They were the ones that steered the Green Revolution through in Punjab and Haryana. And they are the ones who've been on the roads asking for reservation for a while now. Now you would wonder, why would they want to do this? They have land. Why do they want reservation? And why do they sort of get so antsy about their caste identity that they have to proclaim it? The Brahmin proclaims it because there is a challenge. Otherwise, Brahmins don't proclaim their caste identities. The business communities are quiet because they know that they hold the purse strings of many things in this country. But there are communities associated with agriculture and allied forms of work along with agriculture who feel that agriculture is not great in this country. You don't make much money out of it except for a few people. It's better to sort of die than be a farmer. These are all terms that you use today while discussing agriculture. At the same time, there's also the pride of being someone who feeds the rest of the nation. And therefore, there's a certain caste pride that's asserted. And I got this from a website. I want you to read this as well. How does this caste pride express itself? Now, this may not be a representative website. I'm not claiming that this is the last word on how the Jats think about themselves. But this seems to have been around for a long time. And it keeps adding to its whatever it puts up on the site. And this is a very interesting description, self-description of the Jat community. Likely that peasant communities across India might not find this unfamiliar. Many of them would say, yeah, we're also like that. Maybe the details would be different. So here you have a group of hardworking peasants largely who claim that they were once warriors as well, but who yet feel the need to ask for reservation because they feel they're nowhere in terms of education, they are not present in government to the extent that they would like to be, and that they have very little political clout. And that may be true, not true. For each state we can examine that, but that's a self-perception. But at the same time, they feel a sense of pride. Look at us, don't mess around with us. We are this sort of people. And here you find a certain masculine energy, right? A macho-ness, which is evident in the way they talk about themselves. So here you have caste identity being proclaimed in a prideful manner. It's not that pride is absent elsewhere, but this pride is the basis of this sort of a self-identity. And you can see again in your own context, who would be the people that do this? And why would they do that? The peasant communities do this because they feel that they don't have a place and position in the society commensurate with the work that they do, which is that they feed all of us. That agriculture, everyone says, oh, it's a wonderful vocation, but agriculture itself is, in economic terms, doomed in this country, except for some very large farmers. So this is a sense of how they see their profession, and we all know of farmer suicides or many other things. Or if you don't know about them, you can find out. So you have a sense of being part of a community where you feel a bit beleaguered, but at the same time you feel a sense of pride. And we'll see where that pride comes from. It comes through these assertions, but what is the source of that pride? Not just that they think that they are warriors once, that they perhaps were even kings once, but basically they also feel, look, wherever we are, we run the show. Our villages are ours. Whatever we set down as law is the law. And anyone who's grown up in rural India knows how true that is. Right? So, you have caste pride. This is very interesting. This is a last slide for the first part of my talk. Here, this is actually very specific to Tamil Nadu, where in rural and small-time Tamil Nadu, students in school distinguish themselves from each other by wearing these caste markers. These are all students in government schools or government aided schools. And if you look at the caste list there, you'll see that they're all either OBCs or Dalits, scheduled castes or OBCs. Now, why would they do this? What is so important about these caste markers? Because what you find happening in fastly urbanizing, economically mobile states like Tamil Nadu, and this is perhaps true of Andhra Pradesh as well, is that you have at the level of the village or the small town a very dynamic kind of economy and society. No one's doing what their ancestors are doing anymore. Dalits are not doing what they're expected to do. They're studying, they're getting out, they're coming back and doing stuff in the village which annoys people. Then you have the OBCs, some of whom feel that we're not able to make it. Some of our cousins have made it. Here we are in the city. We've got to put up with these upstart Dalits. So you have a kind of a conflict that is very that shapes everyday life in these parts of India. Particularly in the south, you can see it in almost every southern state. Every village is a site of everyday conflicts between communities that are both low in the caste system. The OBCs are not rich, neither are they powerful, but they have access to some land. Dalits don't have access to land, but they have educated themselves. A significant number of them get into higher education or join government, and they are not going to put up with whatever it is that their fathers or their grandfathers and grandmothers put up with. So you have a simmering conflict that is part of everyday life. And that comes through in a very interesting way, the way they assert themselves. You recognize this figure, any of you? On the left? He's a member of parliament. Chandrasekhar Azad from UP. A very interesting young political leader. And he belongs to the Chamar community, scheduled caste Dalit community associated with leather. And he is proclaiming that he is proud to be a Chamar, basically. Now this is a statement that you don't hear often, because very rarely do people from the Dalit communities come out and proclaim we are very proud to be who we are. Because there's such a stigma attached to being Dalit that very few of them feel that they can say it individually. But he is a political person, he also has a movement behind him, and he's saying this. The other one again is from Tamil Nadu. That's a very funny quote. I don't know if anyone here knows Tamil, but basically he's saying that if he's using the Tamil word for God, and he's saying if God is he who rules us, I am greater than God. Why is he greater than God? Because he belongs to this very fierce warrior-like community, he claims. So this is actually the source of conflict. In much of rural and small town Tamil Nadu, you have people like that who find it very important to proclaim who they are. Because that is being challenged, not directly perhaps, but then you have people like Chandrasekhar Azad who are saying, up yours, you think you're great, look at us, we don't mind being what we are citizens like you, we are claiming equal rights. So you have an assertion in the name of claiming human rights. You have an assertion that doesn't know what to do with those who are claiming human rights. So this is a source of caste conflict in vast parts of southern India. Definitely Andhra Pradesh, Telangana and Tamil Nadu and Karnataka. Kerala is slightly different, but it's there as well. So what I want you to notice in all of this is that all of this stuff points to one thing, or many things of course, but one main thing is that the girl who did that Brahmin Instagram stuff, she responds to a situation where government says that you are capable of oppressing others. And that's come about because those who are oppressed say that this kind of behavior is intolerable, it is unconstitutional, it's against the law of the land. No one has a right to claim that they are better than others and tease others. Because many of these student suicides are traced back to hazing and sort of extremely uncivil behavior towards Dalit, Adivasi and minority students. So basically, she is responding to something where she's being challenged, her community is being challenged. If you go back to the second one, caste as resource, they are not responding in any immediate manner whatsoever to whatever is happening around. But very clearly, you will find them saying that we are in charge. third instance, which is of course the rural agrarian castes, they feel completely sort of out of sync with all the changes that are taking place, education, changes in government, and they want to be part of it, but they feel that they are not being listened to. The fourth thing is that there's been so much churning that no one wants to be part of the caste order as it used to exist. So you have people thinking and talking about caste at a moment in time where the caste system is being challenged in different ways. In many cases, the challenge is clear, in many cases, it's not clear. So, but interestingly, how are we meeting the challenge? Right? Whatever communities we belong to. Remember, I said that we're going to explore what it means to think critically and responsibly about caste. How do we talk about it without making these kinds of claims that, so what, the Brahmin is the best, or to say money decides everything, or to say that, look, I'm king in my village, or to start cutting up each other. How do we talk critically and responsibly? Because this is a reality that's around us today. So, one of the things that we perhaps might want to think critically about is that when the girl says, everyone in the village goes to a pandit, you know, you can earn an iPhone, but you think you can earn a Brahmin surname. That comes out of great pride. But how does that pride communicate itself? Now, you can't say that in public and say, I'm better than you, because it's unconstitutional. It goes against the fundamental rights guaranteed to each one of us in the Constitution. You can't say that, though she says it in some ways, but generally you can't go to in a classroom and say that. You could be taken to court. You cannot stand up in a public forum and say that. You can again be taken to court. But how do people who think that they are born to supremacy, they're born to greatness, justify that claim? And one of the things you see in educational institutions is precisely what I've put down here, especially when the discussion is about reservation, is that all these quota students are dumb. They've come here because their cutoff marks are very low. Is that so? Is there a huge gap between the cutoff marks? Yes or no? Do you know what these cutoff marks are? Some of you might know. They're not huge. At the most, they are between 10 to 30 marks. But it is made to appear as if reservation means that the very inept, those who haven't studied, those who haven't done well, can actually just get somewhere because they belong to the reserved quota. And how do you say that? You don't say that in so many words. You say it very differently. You say, I am smart. I am meritorious, like that person says here. I got 95%. So it's merit versus quotas. That's the way the argument unfolds usually. I'm damn smart and you're not smart, but you've gotten. So what is not made clear here is that 95% that someone's got, no one wants to ask if there are quota students who've gotten to the open quota because they also have got 95 marks. Now, these are questions we should be asking. And there are any number of students who could have availed of reservation but who haven't because their marks are very good. So you can't claim merit as your birthright, but you claim it nevertheless because you don't want to accept the fact that today knowledge and education are widely available and that anyone can be smart. Anyone, given the right mix of teaching, support, will actually get 95%. So you find that entitlement presents itself as, look, I'm not saying this because I was born Brahmin, I'm actually very smart. So that's what she means. The pandit is everything in a village. Now who decides that? Who decides that Brahmins are born smart or Brahmins are born intelligent? Who is to check? Do we have a set of tests to check? Do we know this? Are there specific IQ tests we have devised to check how our intelligence can be mapped along caste lines? Obviously not. We are saying this because entitlement allows me to say something and get away with it. I don't need to give any proof. I can just say this. And because everyone listens to what Brahmins say by Tanishka's argument, it's true. That's how it gets around. And if you're popular for saying it, you will of course continue to say it. So entitlement translates as merit. This is again very interesting. Caste as resource. Everyone says, of course, we work very hard. We are successful, we take risks. Anyone can do it. But you go check any statistics on the internet about India's business communities. All top businesses are held by those who are from the traditionally mercantile castes. More than 85% of India's businesses, successful business houses. It's not that you can't break in, you can. But almost everybody is from the so-called Banya community. Whether at the all India level, whether at the local level, or those who have succeeded in becoming Banyas as a community. Like has happened to the Nadars of Tamil Nadu. See that thing there. You all know Shiv Nadar, an educationist, a businessman. Now, what is not mentioned here is, of course, the kind of caste capital that's available to everybody. I just want to spend 1 minute explaining what I mean. If you look at that thing there, welcome to Ayappuram Nadar Uravin Murai Sangam. Uravin Murai means kin. So, Nadars divide themselves into several clans based on kinship ties. And supposing I'm born into a Nadar family and I want to set up a small grocery store, I apply to the society that comprises my clan and my kith and kin, and I'm immediately told where I can mop up capital. If I'm setting up a small grocery business, these should be the things, absolute things that you should have available in your shop. This is how you do it. So I am instructed into my business. I am told how to do this. There's a way in which kinship and community rallies around the individual entrepreneur. And that is very, very interesting. Take the Agarwal, Akhil Bharatiya Agarwal Sammelan. Very interesting again. I read this fascinating story, I think I'm not sure where, in Open Magazine or an Outlook, I'm not sure, where it's a description of an Agarwal marriage Sammelan. So where families get together so they can choose prospective brides and grooms. Now that becomes the occasion to also advertise for your business, to say who owns what flex banner in this room. And then you can decide the comparative worth of your son-in-law or daughter-in-law, potential son-in-law or daughter-in-law. Is a flex small? Is a flex large? What kind of business it is? So you have an interesting way in which marriage and capital come together. So basically you see caste as resource is also nothing to do with character or intelligence alone. It comes out of this very sort of complicated way in which these communities hold themselves together. The Nadars of Tamil Nadu, for example, there are Christians and Hindus amongst them. They intermarry freely. It's more important for them to maintain caste ties rather than insist on religious divisions. Things are changing now for various reasons, but basically that's how it has been historically for them over the last 200 years. So that's something else that we can keep in mind. This lot, the Jats and others, who proclaim right, who proclaim honor and so on, their power comes from seeking control and obedience within their immediate locality. They are not going to put up with claims by women or the so-called Bahujan Dalit castes. Should they make claims about equality? Should they say things about, I will marry who I please? You've all heard of Kap Panchayats. I don't know if you know about Kap Panchayats. These are panchayats attached to particular peasant communities which will decide on how you marry and who you marry. And if someone does something they don't approve of, you could either be, your marriage could be ended, that's a mild thing, or you could be thrown out of the village, that's not too bad either, but you could be killed, as has often happened. So there's a way in which these communities assert their identities in and through control and obedience. But they will not say it in that manner. What they'll say is we are upholding our Sanskriti. We are upholding our culture. We know what is right for the village. Our ancestors have done this for several years. So this is another way in which your caste pride is generalized. See, please note that in each instance, whoever is claiming that their caste is important is doing so in the name of a broad general idea. Brahmins are smart because they are meritorious. Business houses, particular communities maybe, but that's not the reason. We are hardworking, we are risk-taking, we go that extra mile. We are in charge of local Sanskriti, local culture. So everyone is sort of claiming that they are the best in different ways. Now this is not easy to maintain in times of conflict, and what happens then? I don't know if any of you are familiar with these two couples. These are very poignant and tragic love stories from Tamil Nadu, where in both instances the groom was a Dalit, the girl was from an OBC community, and they were both hacked in the middle of a street in broad daylight by the girl's family. She survived, he died. In this case, after marriage, they were split apart, and then he, we are told, committed suicide, or there are a lot of questions whether it was suicide or not. So the conflict that you see today across southern India especially, and I think in parts of Haryana and parts of the north as well, is that this conflict comes home to you when people try to get intimate across caste lines. And then they are punished. So what you have here is caste as conflict is such a part of our changing reality. We only hear of it when these atrocious things happen. But this is built into their everyday life as well. And that's what makes conflict the engine of change. And people who can't take change try and resolve things violently. So what I want you to keep in mind is, we started out by saying, how do we think of caste in our languages? And then we went on to see how people think of caste in particular circumstances. How does a Brahmin think of caste? How does a business person not talk of caste but is still asserting caste identity? How does a peasant caste think of itself? How do castes that are locked together in conflict think of themselves? I started with this because caste is not something that can be taken away from how we think of ourselves. It is very central to our identities in some ways. So these are the ways, some of the ways, this does not exhaust all the ways of thinking about caste. These are some of the ways in which, in today's context, people think about caste, right? So that's what I wanted you to see. But the question is, if all of this has to do with marking boundaries, why are we afraid of breaching boundaries? In every instance, you're marking boundaries, right? If you're saying, I'm smart, you're not smart. I'm taking risks with business, if you take, you'll also be fine. Don't say it's because of my caste. I want to control village life, I'm marking a boundary. And because boundaries are hard to maintain, people start fighting, there's conflict. So basically, what we have in India today is a very dynamic reality of caste. It's extremely dynamic, things are changing, and I think finding it hard to deal with change, we are falling back on caste pride, a sense of caste as entitlement, a sense of sort of maintaining our territory. So we are behaving in a manner that your generation would describe as gatekeeping. You do not want to consider that things may be better, we allow these breaches, that there would be greater mixing, we might all understand each other better, but then we'll also have to think of privilege. You know, why is it that some communities have more and some have less? We'll have to think historically, but instead of doing that, we're doing all of this, right? So let's move on. Now, why do we put up with all this? Culture comes in a big way here. Gatekeeping and marking of boundaries is done in such a manner that you don't think it's gatekeeping. Since you're all students of architecture and design, let me introduce you to something. This is very common. You would have seen it in different parts of the country. Is this culture or is this caste? Vegetarianism, is it a cultural ideal or is it a caste ideal? Or is it both? Who's vegetarian? In Gujarat, I think, because of the Jains, and because everywhere your hotels are saying Shuddh vegetarian, pure vegetarian. So what is vegetarianism? Is it a marker of caste? Is it a marker of culture? Why is it better or not better than those as an ideal from meat eating or fish eating? So you see, caste sets boundaries in modern contexts as well. It's not simply small town India, village India, and so on, but in modern contexts, you have caste trying to retain the borders that separate communities through things like vegetarianism. Food and space, right? And these have always been the historical ways in which caste differentiated themselves. Those who did not eat meat were claimed to be the purest. Those who ate beef were claimed to be the lowest, the cow being held up as a sacred animal. Of course, as animals' rights activists, you may not want to eat meat. That's a different matter. But somebody who raises animals, looks after them, is fond of them, and then butchers one of them for meat is very different from those who never touched an animal but claims that to be vegetarian is great. So we'll have to think of how we think of these things. There's a wonderful poem by a Telugu poet called Gogu Shamala. It's all about how her community raises cattle, with what love, with what affection. Then of a day, if we go to sort of a butcher's shop and buy beef, why are you telling us that we are low? We love these animals. Like all hunter societies, we live with animals. But those of you who claim that you venerate the cow, you don't live with the cow. You don't look after the cow. A very interesting social scientist called Asha Singh from Bihar has written about how Ahir and Yadav women look after cows. So those who claim to revere cows don't look after cows. At the same time, they think vegetarianism is very good. So it's a kind of a boundary marker, gatekeeping thing that they do. And you do this not just with food, it also translates into spatial terms. For a long time, there was a builder in Tamil Nadu called Alacrity Foundations. I don't know if they're still around. But they always said they were known for their separate servant entrances. We give you a tap in your balcony so your servant doesn't have to enter your kitchen was their USP. As architects, you can ponder on that. What does that mean? Why don't you want whoever helps you clean your house in the kitchen? So there are ways in which gatekeeping happens in urban context also, and it assumes a cultural form. Carnatic music is another example. Why is it never Carnatic music? It's always the greatest of all musical traditions. Mind you, I love Carnatic music myself. It's not to say it's not a great musical tradition. But how does it become the acme of music when barely 4% of the population learn it? Again, what boundaries are being marked here, right? Then, when you think of those who patronize the arts, your business communities, what is it that they are upholding as culture? They basically echo what those who are above them, in terms of telling you that I'm the very best, tell you is culture, right? So, one of the earliest and most successful business ventures into publishing was the Gita Press in Gorakhpur, northern India. Every single modern Hindu religious text was published by them. They were very popular, very successful press, entirely bankrolled by a rich Marwari banker and merchant. And that's not the only thing they do. As I said, business communities do a bunch of cultural things. That's the Kiran Nadar Museum's bag. So culture becomes culture not because it pertains to what all of us think is culture, but because there are concerted efforts by the business classes to promote culture in a certain way. So that's also something, and which is why we never notice that there are boundaries that are being sort of erected in all the things that matter to us. Food, where we live, what we listen to, the music we listen to, just everything that makes us human. What we read. So therefore you see we hardly recognize caste in these contexts. We say, why do you bring caste into everything? Because caste is everything in this country. So you see that, right? Even in rural parts, there's such an assertion of rural culture. But it's never just the culture of the entire village. This is bullfighting in Tamil Nadu. And we uphold this as ancient Tamil custom. Is it ancient Tamil custom? We don't know. Maybe it is. But what we do know is, if Dalits were to do the same thing, that's not countenanced. There's a very lovely film called Bison. It's still on Netflix, get it. Which is about a Dalit trying to tame a bull. So basically you have that as well. Now, every time you say something is culture, you're also not accepting some things as culture. So why is it that the funeral drummers' music is not culture? Why is it that the Rudalis' music is not culture? Those who sing during times of death. The Tamasha women of Maharashtra, most of whom are Dalits. How do we claim Tamasha today? We find it cute. There are lots of memes that use Tamasha. But no one wants to admit that it's a cultural form kept alive by the Dalits. It's being appropriated in important ways. So whatever passes off as culture is also dependent on what is not culture. So basically what we need to understand is caste survives not because everybody accepts that there is somebody that is high and somebody that is low, but because caste is being challenged, it comes back to reassert its borderlines. And this has been happening over the last 200 years, 250 years, perhaps it's happened before, but it's clearly in the modern period that there has been a continuous assertion of those who are the victims of the caste system. And how are they victims? This is all more culture, but I'll come back to this. Basically, they are victims of the caste system because they are treated badly, they are not valued as persons, and then they have all said modern education helped them, colonial rule helped them in some ways. They are saying we are all the same. There is shared humanity. There is no such thing as high and low. But it persists. Our mindset is still shaped by it in many ways. And again, just one more example that might be interesting for you, especially those design students that are here. Why do we say art and craft? And why is art on top and craft next to it? Craft in the hierarchy. We say art and craft, no. Art is in the galleries. You can pay several lakhs for a painting. For a basket, you will bargain to get the price down from 75 to 50 rupees. So why are some forms of creativity more important than others? Does it have to do with the nature of the object or the kind of person who does the craft? So that's also something you can think about. Now, basically, those who have tried to fight caste are those that are seldom valued in this society, though they sustain it. All the hardworking people of this country, whether they are farmers, agricultural laborers, tree climbers, leather workers, stone quarry workers, who literally provide us the building blocks of our lives. Weavers, I've not put a great many other communities here, but all of them are valued very, very differently from each other, but none of them are granted the status of people who are creative, people who are competent, people who are intelligent, people who actually are meritorious. They are never seen as meritorious. A stonemason is not seen as meritorious. A leather worker is not seen as meritorious. So this is also a reason why caste sustains itself, and you'll see how. Look at this. You know blue collar, white collar jobs. White collar jobs are professional jobs, clerical jobs, administrative jobs. Blue collar jobs are factory workers and other workers. Just look at these statistics. I don't have to say anything more. Look at these salaries, look at that salary. So many of those who are doing blue collar jobs in this country belong to communities which formerly were doing things like this. Yesterday's craftsmen are today's impecunious factory workers. Some of them don't even work in factories, they work in ramshackle workshops. Your state and my state both have them. So basically you see that this system, even though it's being challenged, survives because as a cultural people, we separate culture into good and bad. We separate knowledge into merit as proclaimed by the upper caste, and everything else is unmeritorious. And this is something that anyone who's interested should read this book, Turning the Pot, Tilling the Land. It's a children's book actually, but I recommended it for all adults as well. It's about who are the makers of this country, who are the ones that keep it going. How do you find intelligence and beauty in these professions? These are 3 books that my publishing house has put out, which is also about those who do things with their hands. And as design students, you should look for design not just in design history and design theories or in the history of Western design, but what our craftspeople do and how do they innovate? What are the conditions of their innovation? But we seldom recognize any of this as knowledge, or nor do we grant it value. So the reason why, in spite of caste being challenged, that things remain in place, the faster you run, you remain in the same place, is because we have an economic structure which makes it very difficult for those who are actually producing wealth to be treated as intelligent, competent, and deserving of better ways of living. In spite of fighting, in spite of reservation, in spite of everything, right? So, and one very important reason, and just give me 10 minutes and I'll end this, very important reason as to why this has been kept alive is because, how many of you read Matrimonial Ads? I used to read it for fun. Great, I'm glad someone put their hands up. Please do a small research project on Bharat matrimony. It's very interesting to do it. How do they make sure everybody finds their life partner without transgressing caste? Because nobody is using the word caste in their advertisements, right? Look at this. This is their. Just notice. Easy register, quick search, matches from your city, fine. Matches from your community. So when you go through that whole list, you sort of skip over that community, but actually all of these are ads for seeking grooms and brides from within your own jati. Every one of them. And how do you know that? Because they have a separate website for intercaste marriages. That's the default setting. The intercaste marriage is the exceptional setting. So basically the other reason why caste is kept alive has to do with the fact that much of India practices what is called caste endogamy. And these days, it's not that, no, we are not observing caste at all. That's not the point. So happened they are from the same caste. Pragmatic romance. And why is that possible today? Given the way our country has developed economically, chances are that you meet the other young people like you because of the kinds of schools and colleges you go to. Earlier, even the wealthy went to public universities where they had to meet those who were not wealthy. Today, it's not like that. Private schools are there, private universities are there, private colleges are there, and chances are you won't meet anyone else except your own kind. And this is not your fault. And so therefore you end up actually choosing people who are not very different from you. And that's the meaning of pragmatic romance. Because you see the price you pay when you're not pragmatic. Not all parents are going to kill their sons-in-laws. But the fact is it happens more widely than it ought to. So this has also kept caste in place. The nature of the economic system and the nature of labor, the way we understand knowledge, and most important, this. And here, women are seen as the linchpin of the system. You've got to marry right. Your brother can do what he wants. Because you are the one on which everything depends. You have to keep the izzat of your community intact, the honor of your community. Because your womb cannot, should not, must not bear the seeds of another caste. Now that's an argument from the Manusmriti to our time. So you see how messy and complicated the system is, though it's being challenged, though it's being questioned and so on. So what do we do with the caste system? How do we think responsibly about it? This is the last part, and I'm not going to spend too much time because I want you to ask questions after this. But basically, I just want to take you through a photo gallery. Talk of reservation, talk of quotas, talk of constitutional rights. How did all this come about? Through struggle. Through the struggles of those who were at the receiving end of the caste system, and they've been fighting for the last 200 and more years. Just look at these people. Different parts of India. Some of them are also not from the oppressed caste, they are from the castes that were powerful. So basically, those who have challenged the caste system saying it is an opponent of equality, it does not value the human person, it perpetuates untouchability, it keeps communities apart. And some of them said it because they felt we Hindus have to hold together because Muslims are holding together. For example, Swami Shraddhanand felt that. But Sant Ram, who was in the same organization as him, which is the Arya Samaj, he said, well, maybe not. We should do it in spite of the fact that it's not just because Muslims are holding together that we should hold together. It's important to fight caste. It's a bad system. So you had these ways of thinking about caste. Either people felt, look, we need to really rethink what it means to be a Hindu. If as a Hindu community we are going to be divided by caste, that's a bad thing because then we are going to be constantly fighting amongst ourselves. Some went an extra mile and said, well, let's not worry too much about high and low. Let's just go back to the Vedas. The Vedas say there are no divisions except those that are based on occupation and character. So maybe that's how we should think of ourselves. Then some others said, it may not be such a bad idea for some people to do some occupations, but let's hold all occupations to be equal. Gandhi said that, for example. a Brahmin and a sanitary worker are both doing important work. Now the question for those who heard them on this subject was this: if it doesn't have to do with birth and anyone can do anything and everything depends on their capacity and so on, why do you need these terms at all? Why do you need the terms? Why do you need the term Brahmin, Kshatriya, or any of these caste terms? Because the moment you keep using these terms, you will try and fit everybody into one category or the other, and older habits will return. So it was a very interesting debate that went on, and then you had someone like Ambedkar who felt all of this should just go. There's no point in trying to save this system. The system must be annihilated. It has no right to exist. It is a cruel and inhuman system. And basically, he described that logic in ways that I think gives us a lot to think about, connected with all that I've been saying about the different kinds of communities. What's the most important word in this, or words in this, which is new to you, which explains something about how the caste system works? Loudly. Okay, what else? Is there one phrase that captures that? There's one phrase that captures the unequal nature of the caste system. What is that phrase? Yes. Have you heard the phrase before? How is it different from non-graded inequality, you think? So take the United States. There's white people, there's black people, right? Mostly, or white and colored. The whites consider themselves better than the colored, generally speaking. Mr. Trump certainly thinks so. So you have a kind of inequality there. That's a simple inequality. Top, bottom, it's clear. But what is graded inequality? It's a very complicated thing. Psychologically it's complicated, structurally it's complicated. So if you think of the caste system like a triangle, with the Brahmins at the top and the working communities, those who are called Shudras at the bottom, is there any equality possible within the triangle as a space? Yes or no? No. So Ambedkar says you don't have simple inequality in the caste order, you have graded inequality. So as you go up the caste ladder, go up the triangle, you are respected. As you come down, you lose respect. And then he says, there are people that are placed outside this triangle, and those are the untouchables. So they can't even have whatever meager claims those at the bottom of the triangle have. In fact, they can't even claim to be human. And his famous phrase was, they've had their very person confiscated. They're not seen as human. So this is the Hindu caste order, he says. Why would you want to retain this? How does it help anybody? Take the question, take the Jat farmers. What makes for their belligerence? Because they can never hope to be like the Brahmins or the Banyas. So their belligerence and their violence comes from that as well. There can never be any kind of equality within that system. You've got to have a very different social system is what Ambedkar is telling us. And when people realize that, then you have conflict. You know, so caste becomes a source of conflict. We think of conflict only in law and order terms. Violence happens, murder happens. Of course, these are all terrible things. They shouldn't happen. But conflict also points to the fact that some people don't like this system. They're challenging it. So there's that. Then I'm going to leave you with one last quote. This is Ambedkar's explanation of what the caste system does and how did it come to be in this country. The second paragraph is sort of a short history as well. We can discuss that later if you like. But basically what he's telling us is that there are different communities, but they're not simply different communities, they're all placed within a hierarchy. So there's a graded inequality there. And that's not enough. Some people were allowed to study, others were not allowed to study. Some people were allowed to wield arms, others were not given the right to wield arms. And some people couldn't rule, some people couldn't read, some people couldn't acquire property, and so on and so forth. So basically, to him, the caste system rests on all these factors. Now, this might be a bit of an overgeneralization, but it's not untrue if you unpack it in your own context. Some of these things might work for you, some may not, but if you were to take these 6 reasons, I can assure you 4 out of 6 you will get in most cases. Because suppression of women is common in all communities. That's already one that's common there. Others might be more or less depending. Graded inequality is common everywhere. In Punjab, in Bengal, in Kerala, everywhere it's common. Other things might have changed with time. But basically you see much of this is what keeps the caste system going. Relate this to what you saw. Why is the Brahmin girl so upset? Because today you can't say I won't educate the Shudras. You can't say I won't educate the Dalits. Why do the Banyas make sure that they keep together? Because today, legally, you're within your right to buy property where you want. Earlier you could say, of course you'll get people who say only vegetarians. But there's no legal basis for it anymore. You can't say a Dalit cannot aspire to be a violin player. Of course you can be a violin player. Right? So that gatekeeping has no basis in law. But it has a basis in how we think about caste. And Ambedkar is calling attention to how we think about caste. And how this is something that has emerged in our context. So, I want to leave you with some further questions. Basically, as young people, starting out on your work, starting out on your education, we may be inclined to think that we are all here by dint of our own merit, no doubt. We've all worked very hard to be here. I know how 11th and 12th can be a nightmare for many of us. Thankfully, our generation didn't have that, but subsequent generations have faced that nightmare. And clearly you're here because you want to do certain things, but it may be useful for you to think of other things that have also enabled you to get here. It could either be that there has been a long history of struggle in your family, in your community, in your neighborhood, which goes back to, work done by people like this, which has enabled you to come here. Or it could be that you have caste capital, you have caste entitlement, or you have caste pride. These things have also been the reasons for getting you here. But having got here as students, as thinkers, potential thinkers, how might we think of where we are from? How might we think of how that shapes our work? When you are architects, when you are thinking of space, when you are thinking of design, how will you account for caste? How will you account for the way a house works when you know a household is where women are constantly demeaned and subjugated? How will you think of space that makes for gender equality? How will you think of buildings that promote gender equality? Design that sustains gender equality? So there are ways in which you can think about this from your own context. And when you're working for clients, how will you understand your project? Is it something that's going to foster respect and mutuality, or is it going to be further gatekeeping that you're assisting? All of us cannot help everything that we do, I know. We take whatever work we get. But it's good to think of these things in your own practice, in your own thought. So caste is not the business of those who benefit from reservation or from quotas. Caste is something that shapes all of us. And once we get a sense of how that works, it might be very interesting for us to rework it in our own context. So I'll stop with this. Thank you for your patient listening. We'll take questions. And if you want the PPT, I'm happy to share it with you. You don't have to take photographs. I can give it to Diana and she can pass it on to you.
Hello. Thank you, ma'am, for the very insightful seminar. The mic is now open if anyone have any questions. Raise your hands.
In your opinion, what can we do to revive art forms which have been forgotten and rebranded due to caste dominance? An example being Sadharatam to Bharatanatyam. Do you think people will accept the revival of the original form, and is it worth it?
Very good question to ask. I think when you revise something, you're doing it in the present, right? So it can't be the original form. You're already interpreting it in some ways. So, for example, if you look at the work of some of these younger dancers in Tamil Nadu, you will see that they are saying that they are bringing back Sadir, which is the earlier form of Bharatanatyam, but then they do performances which include reading the constitution at the end of it all. So it's an interesting mix of things that unfold on stage. Or if you take something like the drum that Dalits beat at funerals. Now Ambedkar was very against that whole musical tradition because he felt it's being forced on Dalits. But then there are groups today that say that let's claim it as a badge of our identity and produce interesting music for the present. So I think it can go in different ways depending on the precise form in question, on how you rework it. And sometimes it can have universal balance also. Take something like jazz and blues. They were linked to the African American community, but today they have become universal musical forms. Take the Tamil film composer Ilayaraja. He's from the Dalit community, but who will say that his music does not have, does has only Dalit elements? So he has reworked his own Dalitness into a very interesting musical tradition also, eclectic musical tradition.
So, ma'am, for the census which is going to take place, a caste-based census is going to take place this year after maybe 100 years. So, what is your take on that? Is it a step towards which way I don't know? Like, what is your take?
Good question again. I have very mixed feelings about it because if it is going to be used for intelligent planning, for making available public resources in ways that benefit those who have not had a share of public resources, it could be a good census. The census itself is just an activity. What are you going to do with that information is the question, right? Now, if that's going to be a way to assess which population votes for whom, it's going to be used to assess who thinks in what way, or to sort of make everything depend only on a certain set of plans, like say the reservation policy. Should more OBCs get reservation? That's not a bad thing or good thing in itself, but by saying that, you're also not addressing other questions, right? For example, if you're saying more communities should come into reservation, say the judge should get reservation. But the problem of the judge is not simply that they are not there in education or in public life. It's also that they feel that they lack social presence and value in some ways. And that whatever they do is also being consistently downgraded because we have never really granted the intelligence of the peasant. So if agriculture continues to be compromised and their lifestyles don't improve, a few of them getting into government jobs won't actually solve the larger issues that they are raising. But yes, it's good for a few of them to get into government jobs also, but you don't need a caste census for that. So how do we think about this? It's interesting. There's a very interesting book you can read by Anand Teltunde called The Caste Consensus. He is married into the Ambedkar family and is a very provocative thinker. So you may find that book interesting because he says, I'm not sure reservations are going to help anymore. So far they've served a purpose. Or the caste census is going to help. There are others who say it might help. Yogendra Yadav, for example. You can hear him on YouTube. Some people think it works, but Teltunde makes a very provocative and interesting case, which is worth thinking through.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was very simple in terms of understanding something so complex. My question revolves around the concept of power and how there is such a disparity despite being the general idea of populace that is affected by discrimination. And so, when for designers like us or for policymakers, when they are designing an intervention to sort of counter this discrimination, how do we sort of redistribute the power in a way that it is not a policy, but it's a direct attempt to challenge the power, when also this caste hegemony is so internalized as well?
You can't challenge caste as caste anymore directly because it's so much part of everything else that is the structure around us, right? So, as say, if your policymakers, your architects, for example, how do you sort of bring a critical caste perspective into what you're doing? That's in that manner one can think about it creatively. Take public housing, for example. Public housing is a very interesting concept. So far, only the government has thought of it. And all, at least in the south, and in Tamil Nadu, I know we've had the slum clearance board from the 70s, and then the Tamil Nadu housing board schemes. Now, when government thinks of such a scheme, do they think of it in an organic way? In terms of what are we doing with this scheme? We are providing houses for people who can't afford to have their homes. Most likely they are Bahujan Dalits. Not entirely, but most likely. What is their sense of space? How do they think of space? We don't ask those questions. We imagine that since it's a government offering, you can get the cheapest contract going, the cheapest material going, you don't have to do much. But if you can, there's a possible dialogue between architects sensitive to caste and space and policy makers who are initiating things with the government. You can have a very different and very humane housing culture in this country. How do you do that is the question. And you know the history of architecture also, the early days in the Soviet Union, for example, when they built these humongous things where workers were all meant to live together and everyone were meant to live together. For the first time, the upper classes and the middle classes had to do with one-room tenements. They never lived like that in the past. But everybody was meant to live together like that. Now that is one kind of a ferocious solution, where we all understand what it means to live with bare minimum thing. But the other kind could be that we all live together, but with more or less the same facilities, except where if you are differently able or you need attention of some kind or the other. And there were those architects also in the Soviet Union at that time who were thinking in creative ways. Given that the relationship between caste and space, how do you break the thing between vegetarians only and others only? Or if you go to any Indian village, the village proper and the Dalit settlement, the Dalit Wada. How do you think of public housing? Can we tell government that it ought not to build anything that promotes these divisions? Because it would be a constitutional mandate. So in Tamil Nadu you have a scheme called Samatvapuram, the equality homes. But they are built so badly, so loveless, no one wants to go and live there. So I think we need a more rich, organic approach to thinking about some of these things, and that will possibly come about when we know the rich histories of struggle, what people have thought about, what has been their understanding of space, and all of that.
Thank you so much. I have one more question. So, while you were also talking about that, for example, there have been policy level or interventions to counter caste discrimination, such as reservation. But what usually happens is the resistance that comes from people who are in power, who feel threatened that somehow their position is being compromised. So, when you think of it that way, where do you think the leverage lies in educating the people who are ignorant towards it and who observe caste, or people who are being affected by it negatively in a way that it takes away their opportunities?
So go back to the first question that I posed to all of you. How do we negotiate caste in our family spaces? I think that everything has to do with that. How do we grow up? What are we told? You can think about it. You don't have to discuss this in public if you don't wish to, that's fine. But each of us grows up in a caste family, don't we? And there are moments in history when people thought about the caste family and wanted to change it. For example, today Sabarmati is a tourist spot, but Sabarmati was an experiment in living. How do you live? Maybe there were very few Dalits there, maybe one or two families. But there were people of all other kinds. People from across India, Muslims, Hindus, Christians. So there were exercises in living together which makes it possible for us to think of ourselves differently. Now, we need to also think imaginatively in that sense and not simply about how do we teach people. Because it's not that people don't know. Everyone knows caste is boundary marking. Everyone knows caste gives you certain kinds of resources. That it puts you in a certain league and puts others in a certain other league. That's why I said look at your own family conversations. They also might not use the word jati or caste. They might say not our people, not our kind. Why are you bringing people like that into the household? It need not be anything straightforward. But constantly we are doing that within our familiar spaces. And it's sad to say much of this work is done by women. Because women are the ones that keep the household together. And if they don't do that, they will get punished themselves. So there's a lot here to be said for how as feminists we engage with caste. How do we understand caste? What do we think about it? Can a mother who opens her house to all her children's friends, she's actually playing a role in weakening the hold of caste. Who doesn't mind serving them all tea in the same lota. You might think this doesn't happen in today's India. No, it happens all the time. It's so subtle you don't notice. And of course, when it comes to love, you notice it first and foremost. Love and romance. So I think that area needs to be really addressed. And how does one bring a feminist sensibility as well to understanding caste? So then you have a sense of yourself, you respect yourself, you have a sense of your own freedom. You would approach the freedom of your daughters or your sons differently. So that's one way of looking at it. The other thing is constant dialogues like this, that we all take responsibility. It can't be any one person's mandate, no. So as young people, starting your career, starting your work, you can think of the social responsibility of what does it mean to address caste. Maybe we can't all do it at the same time. We need to do some things now, some things later. But if it's a question that you keep in your mind, it can be a very interesting constraint for you to work with. Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, after him, please call the mic.
So, leading on to what you just said about we find caste when love and romance comes in. Caste, in my opinion, caste cannot function without patriarchy being in place. It is so the two examples that you showed. If the castes of these people were reversed, they might not have faced these circumstances. A little milder, maybe not this. So, hypergamous marriages is what is very crucial to address caste. Even Ambedkar says about it. In your opinion, how far we have come about accepting hypergamous marriages? One, and it's not just about the hypergamous marriages within the different caste groups. It is also with our caste groups also that the bride would not earn as much as the groom. So how far we have come? Are we progressing? And what is your opinion on all this thought?
Where the status of the bride is higher than that of the groom socially or economically, you call it a hypergamous marriage. Now we all know that it's not seen as normal. I mean, even a tall bride and a short groom is not considered normal, right? It starts from there. A fair bride is necessarily the groom need not be fair. You look at all these matrimonial ads, wheat complexion is only for women. So what is made very clear is that the onus is on women to sustain the family, whatever the disadvantages they face, whether they like this marriage or they don't like this marriage or whatever it is. And the pressure is on them to do the right thing by the family. While a boy may also be sort of told that he has to do the right thing, he may not face as dire a consequence. He might face in some cases, but in some cases he might not, unless he's a Dalit person. So this is how it works for the most part. Has it changed? I think in times, in historical moments when there were white democratic people's movements, where many things were being discussed, and people got to know each other because of their politics, that they were there in that space together and they liked each other and they decided to get married. There was some kind of a social support for that sort of marriage. For example, one of the couples that suffered, where a young man was believed to have committed suicide, that happened in a part of Tamil Nadu that had known a long history of democratic struggles. Jayaprakash Narayan's Chatrayuga Sangharsh Vahini was active there. Many of the Marxist-Leninist groups were active there. Now, in those times, these marriages happened as a matter of course, and there wasn't any great public opposition. Of course, families would be annoyed for some time, but afterwards they sort of give up. So such things are possible and have happened in this country. And hypergamous marriages have happened only where these circumstances have obtained. sometimes because of certain kinds of social movements, like Periyar's in Tamil Nadu, for example, Ramasamy Periyar's self-respect movement, where marriage was seen entirely as a matter of choice. Never mind age, never mind anything. Then it was possible that some of these things were accepted, and they were acceptable also within the broad framework of the movement, and you had at least 1 or 2 generations practicing such marriages. Today too it continues, but perhaps not as much as there was in the past. So you need some kind of a social recognition that this is all right for it to be practiced on a larger scale than it otherwise would be practiced. It cannot be done only through individual counseling. You need social recognition also. You need social support. For example, recently in Tamil Nadu, the Communist Party of India Marxists have said, we will keep our offices open in certain areas, 24 hours. Anyone who's marrying across caste is welcome here. The party will support you. And then they announced that we have done so many marriages over the last so many months. So you need that sort of space as well, I think. Otherwise, in a country like India, it can lead to social tension, violence, murder, at any level. Somebody at the back, you had wanted. Yeah. No? Yes, here.
Yeah, so it was a really interesting talk, and I think it opened up a lot of areas to think about. So I don't really have a question, but it's sort of an opinion and an answer to what you had posed earlier, which is the difference in cutoffs that people are sometimes agree to and don't agree to. So I would say that the difference between the cutoffs is high, because if there's a difference of 10 to 30 marks within the cutoff of the general and the reserved quotas, when there's people, like 100 people in the difference of 1 mark, then I think it really does make a difference. Because if in the reserved categories, they get the option of choosing whether to avail for the reserved or to apply through the open. But the people in the open category don't get the choice of that. They just have to apply with the open. So when there's 200 seats to apply for, the open people get only 100, but the reserved category gets 200. So I think that is a disparity where there's a lot of disagreements that come with the reservation policies.
We need to think about this maybe in a much more differentiated manner as well. We take the percentage of people who apply under the open category in terms of the percentage of in their population. Example, those who are applying in the open category constitute 7% of the population. I'm just throwing a random figure at you. But the applicants are far more than 7%. Whereas when it comes to the Dalits who are 18%, you barely have 2% of the Dalits applying even. So what we're talking here are intergenerational backlogs, right? The reservation system is not the last word in social justice, but it's certainly been a very efficient way of marshalling those who have had not the opportunity to be part of any formal education systems over generations to find a foothold there. Now, how many of those in the open category lose out? A segment loses out, no doubt, but the segment also likely, I'm not saying it happens in all cases, has the resources to go and study elsewhere. Whereas most people under the reserved category can only avail of reservation in public sector institutions and have the means only to study there. So that's also something we need to think about in the context of all of this. So I think what is important for young persons to keep in mind is each of us might feel individually aggrieved and perhaps there is a certain logic to it. But in the larger run, what do we do? This is the question. How do we clear historical and intergenerational backlog? One way of doing it is increase the number of colleges, increase the number of seats. But we're not asking the government to do that, are we? We're saying cut back on reservation. Now we need more seats basically. And so it's a very complicated argument, but I think the reflexive response has been that we don't want these quota students hogging our seats. That's been a very kind of a crude response. I think young people are confused also because it's not clear how this will pan out if there are more seats. How can we talk about this rationally? Do we have any sense of whoever has missed out on their seat? Have they ended their education? Were they able to study further? Who supported them? Once we have all this information, we can make more rational decisions. But right now, the way it is, it seems that a very small cohort of people who managed to finished their education and have access to coaching centers and have done well are holding the rest of the population at ransom. Even though the individuals in that group may not find a seat in the thing. So let's think about it. We need to think about it carefully. I don't think we have enough information. We have enough arguments here to make any kind of statement about the sources of that resentment. As I understand it, it's largely because we don't want to think that there are people coming in who are basically telling us that, look, you've been here long enough, it's our turn now. I don't think we like that. And it's a cruel thing to happen if you're kind-hearted and you're a good person. But that alone is not enough in caste society, no. We're talking of generations, we're talking of decades. So,
I feel like, in response to that, I would say that when people around you who have had the same resources as you still avail the caste quota just because they can, then I think that is also somewhere where the disagreement stems from. And also, I feel like the situation would get better if it wasn't just restricted to caste, and if instead of caste, if it would just go to class. Because right now, instead of a caste-based society, it should be class-based reservations, because people with different economic backgrounds should have the facility to avail the caste-based, like the reservation portion. Because if people who have the economic ability, in spite of being from a lower caste per se in today's society, if they avail the seats which are reserved, then the people who actually need them are missing out.
see, we are not concerned here when we make a claim that we are not getting in. We are not saying that those from the Dalits who actually deserve are not getting it. That's not the argument made by those who oppose reservation. Basically, they are saying, I'm not getting my seat. So that's one thing. Second thing is, I would encourage you to go and read the Mandal Commission report. Because class and caste are not far apart in this country.
I have, so
No, you have to go through the various criteria that he
I
uses.
have read the Mandal Commission
Yes.
and the second
Yes, and-
backward class commission.
But class cannot replace caste. Caste is a very specific kind of social relationship.
That it was. I also know that when the Mandal Commission was first, like when it first came out, there was a lot of disagreement with it as well, because throughout India, that instead of focusing on just caste as a population, there should be a lot of other factors which should be accounted for as well. One of which was the economic backgrounds, because people of varying economic backgrounds, I feel, should get the reservations because they genuinely deserve it.
I'm not sure I agree with you on that. I think you need to study the Mandal Commission more carefully, because I don't think he insists only on caste. He also talks about intergenerational poverty. Go back and read
Yeah,
the criteria,
definitely.
because he talks about economic communities, for example, which do not have these provisions, do not have those provisions, and they're all class-based markers. We need
Right.
to have a longer dialogue. I don't want us to hog the conversation, because I also feel I would encourage you to think a little more carefully. You can't replace caste with an economic category, because the Constitution very clearly says educationally and socially backward, not economically backward.
But the reservations are caste-based.
Yes, that's socially and educationally backward is a euphemism for caste. You go and follow the debates around the First Amendment, the debates around social justice in the Constituent Assembly. These refer to caste-based groups. Granted,
Right.
yes, there may be some within those groups who are well off. For 2 or 3 generations, they have been wealthy. But for everyone who makes it, there are 50 who don't. Because 3% of Brahmins still dominate 40% of the services in most parts of India. 4% of Brahmins dominate, the 36% dominate the higher judiciary after all these years of reservation. So we're talking about a very complex social system. Let's think about all those factors. But I think we should pass the mic on. There, here. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask your views on, you mentioned food habits earlier very briefly. I just wanted to ask about that as a result of personal belief, because there is obviously caste and class influencing what one chooses to eat. But is it possible to be vegan or vegetarian? Because there is a lot of conversation about caste and class regarding vegetarianism specifically. But I've seen a lot of communities maybe more recently in India, vegan communities that use terms like Satvik or Jain or Ahimsa, and that is very cultural. That maybe that culture influences their choice in that way. Like my personal choice that I don't consume animal products is because of my own ethics and other reasons. But oftentimes I see this as well. Do you think that is going to be something that happens more often?
Yeah, it is hard to be a vegetarian on the basis of principle alone, because clearly the situation is so overdetermined, no? That we have a larger and longer narrative about vegetarians being upper caste and everyone else being lower caste. That may or may not be true in an empirical sense, but that's the received knowledge that we have. So in that sense, to be a vegetarian by choice puts you in a bit of a spot. How do you think about it? But I think the important thing is to see that it's a choice that we can make for certain reasons, and that choice has come about because we are in a position to enforce it for ourselves. And food is never a matter of self-enforcement for a majority of the
So
population.
it's a choice that some people get to make and some people don't.
Don't get
maybe.
to make.
Okay.
There's
fair
that
enough.
also. For example, when Ambedkar talks about, he asks the Dalits to give up eating beef for various historical reasons. I think he also didn't like beef personally, which is also, that's how it is. Food is also a matter of personal choice. But like most Maharashtrians from the coast, he loved fish. So basically, I think it's a mixture of personal choices, but then it will never is a personal choice. Just like how property, whether you have access to making a choice in terms of continuing to do what you do in spite of others doing something different. All these remain social choices. And then the poor or those that are deemed low in the caste hierarchy have never really had access to the diversity of food that the upper castes have had. Let me give you a very small example. A student in the history department of JNU was they have a writing program where students learn to think historically and write historically. And the first exercise they do is write something from their own familial histories. So this young person from Tamil Nadu wrote a fascinating essay on when he ate his first dosa. And he was not a Dalit, he was from a peasant community, and basically he was saying, dosa and idlis are not staple foods for most peasants. This was not something we grew up, and he's perhaps in his late 20s today, 26, 27, so he's not some, from many, many years ago. But basically what he was trying to say was, even what we take for granted as cultural, like Tamil Nadu is equal to idli dosas, that may not be true of most communities. They've all got into this habit for various reasons. But those communities which are still dependent on agriculture and do things, there's a certain other food routine that they practice, especially in millet growing areas. So I think caste is such a, food and caste are related to in very complex ways that because it has become completely sort of polarized into vegetarian and non-vegetarianism, we're not able to talk of other things. And if we are making choices based on our love for animals or the ethics of the meat industry and so on, it is a lonesome choice. We can still make those choices, but you may still love your, like, Gogu Shamla's poem, for example, she loves her cattle. They look after that animal so happily and so on. But it is also the hunter society's thing. I eat what I live with. Is that culture also? So it's not that they don't love animals. A friend of mine runs a school for nomadic children, all of whom are extremely sharp and clever with the, what do you call it, yeah? Forget it. That sling. Where they bring down birds, but they are the ones who will nurse any animal back to life if it's hurt. So they have an intimate relationship with the animal world. At the same time, they see that eating an animal is part of that relationship. That's also a cultural thing. So it's not that those who eat meat are not interested in animal welfare. It is not that those who eat meat do it because it's their choice. So I think there are very many complex things there.
Yeah, that's fair, I think. Thank you.
I have
Wait,
just
wait. Someone at the back there. There.
First of all, thank you for the talk. So we've established that caste and patriarchy are not two different systems. They are one. And I was just trying to understand, how does caste operate in a matriarchal or a matrilineal society? And yeah, basically this. If you could elaborate and
Matrilineal can also be part of a patriarchal structure, because matrilineal is not matrifocal, matrilineal is not matriarchal. Descent is reckoned through the brother or the uncle. I mean, Kerala, people from Kerala perhaps know this in an everyday existential sense, what it means to be part of a matrilineal society, which until the last 100 years ago was very much present and active. You also have a matrilineal descent in the Khasi communities of the Northeast. So what does that mean? Where does it empower women? Where does it leave women having to sort of look up to the kin network, whether it's the brother or the cousin or whoever? So these are complicated questions, I think. So patriarchy, the term patriarchy of course means that it, in a very broad sense if you interpret it, that it means that it is rule and governance by men who have access to resources and will hold on to them, and you can only access them should they deign to share them with you or you fight. So in that sense, a matrilineal system can also be patriarchal. And in the Nayar, classic Nayar matrilineal, there was a further complication with the marriage system, that they could take in lovers from the Nambudri community, or they were forced to in some cases, and they may not have legitimate marriages in other cases. So there are ways in which women's sexuality and choices are constrained even within that setup. I would leave it there for now. There's a very nice book by Arunima called Here Comes Papa. You can read it. G. Arunima. Yes.
So I've only just begun to work on Paswanda Muslims in the context of Bihar, Dalit Muslims in the context of Bihar, and we've known that for the last, at least for the last 3 decades, the idea of recognizing Dalit Muslims, Dalits within Muslims and Christians is ongoing. And I just wanted to spell it out in the case of Bihar and the caste survey that was done in 2023, not census but survey, and which has not been recognized officially, which in terms of the Muslim community, only 3 to 4% are upper caste who hold the majority of social, economic, and cultural capital. The 96 to 97%, and I mean, I'm also trying to answer a young friend here that this 96 to 97% of the community, one community, entire community, does not have access to education or basic infrastructure services like water, electricity. I mean, probably 80 to 85% of that entire community. So, I mean, in relation to this, I just wanted to ask you to throw some light on how, for example, people like Zoya Hassan talk about how political representation will further this idea of empowerment. So what do you think that how far would political representation help the cause of both religion and caste?
I have to answer this from today's context to some extent. And I'm in a state where it didn't matter if we were the 3% or the 80%, the outcomes were the same in 2002. People survived some things better, many people didn't survive all that well. So we're living at a time where the community as a whole is being viewed in a certain sort of way. So that reality is something we can't think ourselves out of, and we're being reminded of it in every which way, right? So that's one way of, one framework that one needs to sort of, we can't abandon it. At the same time, the differences between Muslims in terms of Ashrafis and others, I think there are very interesting regional variations. I think the United Provinces, former parts of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar would be one set of, one way of, one kind of model. Bengal is very different. The south is completely different. Tamil Nadu, Karnataka, parts of Telangana are very different. The Ashrafis are almost negligible, except for a very small community of merchants who claim themselves to be Sayeds. But the majority of the population is what you say, 85%, 90% and so on. But what has political representation done for them is an interesting question to ask. And here is where the differences across the states matter. In Tamil Nadu, they, for example, the non-Ashrafi Muslims saw themselves as part of the Dravidian movement. So there, understanding of the critique of religion or the critique of the priestly class affirmed for them that you don't need a mediator between Allah and the Muslim on the street. So therefore they felt a certain kinship with the movement. And Periyar also counseled that Islam was a religion of equality and the Ummah is a symbol of brotherhood. So he counseled Dalits to convert to Islam. So it has had a very different role to play in terms of politics. And Muslim representation presence is very central to how the Dravidian parties have worked with their electoral politics and their larger social justice politics also. Kerala is another interesting example. Karnataka also. I think basically the problems that we face when we come to Pasmandas have a lot to do with the nature of history and politics in the Gangetic Plain. And it must be addressed as such rather than a broader Pasmanda politics which encompasses all of India. I don't think it can work that way at all. Political representation in the manner of having Muslims in parliament is certainly very important, considering that that is completely not there anymore. But at the same time, it is very important to heed the kinds of issues that people within the community are also raising. Women have been raising a very pertinent set of issues forever from within the community. And now lower caste Muslims, so-called lower caste Muslims and Dalit Muslims are also raising these issues. And so these become important as well. How does a community work with these issues is something that we need to think about region to region. What is that relationship of that to political representation? Because political representation in itself is important, but how do you ensure that that representation works to also mitigate contradictions within the community? There's been some interesting studies about the old city of Hyderabad, for example. Salaluddin Owaisi's party, MQM, and it is largely a Bahujan party. That's also interesting. They are not Sayeds, they are not Ashrafis. As a Bahujan party, what have they done? It's a very interesting question. There's some new work that C.D. Moeed and Sunita have done, which is sort of help us understand some of these issues. Yes.
I have another question. So, say in India, if caste is the starting point of anybody's primary identity, what part of their identity does caste not account? And then further, how can we decentralize the focus from caste to another or an alternate form of identity that is not derogatory or is not discriminatory towards them?
I think all of us break with caste in ways we don't recognize, right? When we make friends, when we listen to music, when we eat food that we like. But there is no social register to see these as legitimate. That's our problem. And we do this either because we think it's our taste, we like it, but there's no way of validating it. If you belong to community A and you're doing something which is only seen as done by community B, then how do you account for your own taste? Basically, you have to say that I am doing it, it's my taste. So, which is also true. You are not falling in line with your community, you're doing something that you like. So much of our lives, whether falling in love, eating food, listening to music, going to movies, we are doing things not as caste beings. But then we remain caste beings. And why do we remain caste beings? It's because of our familial context, because of the way our families are caste families, and because of the way that caste grants us a sense of entitlement and caste is a resource. So any attitudinal changes alone won't help in this case. We need redistribution of income, we need breaking down of the monopoly on knowledge that certain castes enjoy. So all these things are equally important. So we are not caste beings all the time, certainly not. Otherwise we won't be human, would we? We don't think all the time about where we are from and manage every bit of our lives in that way. And I think educational institutions, public spaces have helped a lot to make us other kinds of beings, especially modern democratic cultural spaces, whether it's a political party, a movement, a students' union, a theatre group, a singing group, or a classroom where you do projects together. Certainly we are not caste beings at all times. Where do we remain caste beings is marriage, which is very central to everyone's life, even if you're against it. So I think those are the issues we need to keep in mind also. There is a structural basis to this.
One more question. I'm sorry.
Shall we just see if anyone else wants a question and
yeah.
how long can we go on? One more question. So we must leave the mic to.
First of all, thank you so much for the talk. It was very enriching. Secondly, my family follows Sikhism, and I have noticed one of the core beliefs of the faith is that we have abolished the caste system completely. But I have noticed people who do practice Sikhism that they do end up bringing up caste in a lot of things like marriages. And in a lot of conversations, I've heard the caste such like Jats and Ramgaryas being mentioned constantly. So, is it that the caste system is so culturally rooted in Indians, or is it that it's such an ego-driven interpretation of an identity? What is it that it is, even though it is completely not part of the religion, people still follow it? I want to know your opinion on that.
Actually, Sikhism is a very interesting example because it was explicitly founded to do away with social inequalities. And Nanak himself, wonderful poetry to that effect, the songs are wonderful, we all know this. But see, go back to what I said just now, caste is also structure, no? So, say communities within that have embraced Sikhism, in the Langar you can be equal, everyone can be fed. But will you part with land? That's the question, right? Will you part with land? I don't know if some of you remember during COVID, some of you might have still been in school, the Kisan protests. And much of those protesters were from the Punjab. Many of them were Sikhs. But there was an internal critique that emerged on the streets. What about Dalits? Are you going to fight for the rights of Dalit peasants as well? What about women whose husbands have died or committed suicide and who are farmers themselves? So while Sikhism might provide a certain kind of a interpretative framework, ultimately that Sikhism is practiced within a social and economic universe where power is very unequally distributed. So there may be good individuals to whom Sikhism matters a great deal and they might mitigate these tensions somewhat. But real justice lies in sharing resources, in being fair and equal even towards those with whom you don't have a great personal relationship. So I think that spirit of Sikhism needs to also be linked to a larger spirit of redistribution, of respect and equality in an everyday sense as well.
Right, thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an insightful session. It was very helpful, and we thank you.
Thanks for all the great questions. Good luck.